happen to our bees? And let me be specific, by our bees, I don't mean the European honeybee. I'm talking about Australian native bees. How will climate change impact them? And this is a difficult question because there's not a lot of research that has been conducted to cover this topic. However, that is changing. There are more and more research projects being devoted to our native bees, the stingless social bees, and the more than 1,700 other species of Australian bees. So let's have a look at what we're learning about how these high temperatures might impact our native bee populations and therefore our populations of native plants and therefore the pollination of many of our crops. Native bees in Australia have been dealing with extreme weather events for thousands upon thousands of years. It's just the nature of the continent. But what happens when the temperature is regularly higher? What happens when you combine temperature rises with things like habitat loss and insecticide use? Well, there have been some studies on that, and we're going to have a look at that. But first, a little bit of background. I've heard scientists call Australian native bees lazy because they don't get out of bed unless it's above at least 18 degrees Celsius. Now, that's still pretty cold in my opinion, but I'm living in the tropics. Your European honeybees, they're up at lower temperatures than that. Any of the studies discussed in this video will be linked in the description down below if you'd like to check them out yourself. First one we're going to look at is in 2020 and 2021, in amongst all the lockdowns because of that virus, Jare from Monash University conducted a study on various berry farms, and what she discovered was quite interesting. She discovered that while European honeybees will actually forage at a wider temperature range, it was a native bee, a little reed bee, that was most active at the higher temperatures. This study also included Lasioglossum bees, and the conclusions were that while Apis mellifera, or the European honeybee, may be able to forage at a greater range of temperatures, there are a number of bees that can function at higher temperatures, and this is going to have implications for not only our food plants but also our native plants. I first read about Sarah's research in the Cross Pollinator, which is a monthly newsletter sent out by the Australian Native Bee Association. And if you're interested in Australian native bees, I recommend you join. They share lots of resources and knowledge in this area that, frankly, is suffering from a lack of observations, or at least recorded observations. Ultimately, the article that I read revealed that while Australian native bees do forage at a wide range of temperatures and therefore are not at immediate risk from climate change, there is a risk that due to the impacts of a changing climate, particularly on floral resources, this may cause bee populations to suffer in certain areas and therefore puts them at more of a moderate risk at this time. A recent article published in the Journal of Thermal Biology studied 3 different stingless bee species in Australia, and they concluded, based on their findings, that pupae and larvae inside the hive are more resistant to heat stress than foragers, which means we don't have to worry as much about our hives, what's inside them, but we do have to worry about the bees that are bringing back the resources for that hive and feeding the larvae and pupae. They established heat stress thresholds for these species, and then they concluded that recent heat events in Australia have already exceeded those thresholds, which is very worrying. Their research suggested that heat stress thresholds around 40 to 45 degrees Celsius become lethal for our stingless bees, and once again this is very worrying. Holly Farnan, a researcher with James Cook University in far north Queensland, has done some really interesting research on tetragonula Hawkingsi bees, who are some of our stingless bees. And her research suggests that when bees are exposed to non-toxic insecticide levels, while they're still alive, they're actually more susceptible to heat stress afterwards. This has extremely worrying implications, particularly in the sense that with so many agricultural areas very close to wild areas, our foragers are in danger of becoming exposed to insecticides. Does this mean that when we have heat waves, as we have had frequently this year and last year, it's 2024 now, they may succumb to the heat because their tolerance has been reduced from insecticide exposure? That's a brief summary based on some of the more recent research projects that I've found. I'm sure there are lots in the pipeline. Indeed, there's a very interesting one being run with the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia, where they are observing their stingless bees, a very important part of their culture, and they're going to be looking at the implications of climate change, which anecdotally they've already noticed, particularly in terms of floral resources not being available when they usually are, and a decline in their native bee population. So what can we do about this? Can we do anything about it? Well, many aspects of climate change are essentially up to our policymakers. And yes, we can influence that by voting in the right people and by making our views known. There are things we can do at home. First of all, plant native plants. The more native plants we plant, the more we are supporting our local bee populations. And indeed, some of our native plants can only survive if they are pollinated by local bees. We can also stop using insecticides in our gardens. If you would like some ways of controlling pests in your garden without using insecticides, then please check my channel, because I do have a couple of videos on different foliar sprays and other methods of pest control that don't involve insecticides. And I can tell you that on my property, 18 months after moving here, we have noticed a significant increase in insect life, which then of course brings the birds and the mammals and the reptiles, and it's a lovely thing to be able to connect with that much nature in your own garden. So plant native, find alternatives to chemical insecticides, and there's more, but let's start simple. Let's start with a couple of simple methods. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your support, and thank you to the viewers who requested that I cover this topic. I hope you're satisfied with my response. Please, if you want to request a topic, don't hesitate. Just throw it in the comments or message the Wood Wide Web Facebook page. Now, the other thing you can do to support the channel is you can watch some more videos, you can subscribe, like this video. It makes such a difference to the YouTube algorithm. And I will see you next time, giving more opportunities to be one with nature.